Welcome, gentle souls, to this sacred hour where the ancient world whispers its secrets through the veil of time. Tonight, we embark on a journey through 1,000 years of medieval folklore, where dragons soar through starlit skies and forgotten kingdoms hold mysteries that have echoed through countless generations. Whether you're seeking rest after a long day or simply yearning for the comfort of timeless tales, I'm honored you've chosen to spend these precious moments with us. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, what corner of the world has brought you to these ancient stories, and what draws you to the folklore of ages past. There's something magical about how these medieval tales can unite strangers across continents and centuries, binding us together through the universal human need for wonder and meaning. If these gentle journeys through history bring you peace, consider joining our community of dreamers and storytellers. We have countless more tales waiting to guide you through the quiet hours, each one carefully chosen to transport you to realms where anything was possible. Tonight's journey begins in the mist-shrouded valleys of medieval Europe, where every shadow held a story and every whisper carried the weight of ancient wisdom. For over a millennium, from the fall of Rome to the dawn of the Renaissance, ordinary people lived alongside the extraordinary, weaving tales that would survive long after their humble cottages had crumbled to dust. Have you ever wondered why certain stories have endured for centuries, while others fade into oblivion? The answer lies not in their fantasy elements or magical creatures, but in their profound understanding of the human heart. These weren't merely entertainment for peasants gathered around flickering hearth fires. They were vessels of wisdom, carrying truths about love, loss, courage, and redemption that spoke to something eternal within the human spirit. What I'm about to share with you will reveal the hidden depths beneath familiar fairy tales and forgotten legends. These stories weren't created in isolation by individual authors. They emerged from the collective consciousness of entire civilizations, shaped by centuries of retelling, each generation adding its own hopes and fears to the eternal tapestry. But before we lose ourselves in the enchanted forests and towering castles of medieval imagination, let me paint the world that gave birth to these extraordinary stories. Picture Europe in the year 800, just as Charlemagne was crowned Holy Roman Emperor. The classical world had crumbled, leaving behind a landscape of small kingdoms, isolated villages, and endless forests that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace, yet their imaginations soared across oceans and into realms that defied earthly limitations. This was a world where the boundary between reality and magic remained beautifully blurred. A traveling merchant might bring news of distant lands where men had the heads of dogs or where trees bore fruit of pure gold. A village-wise woman might know remedies that seemed to work through supernatural means, while the local priest spoke of miracles that happened just beyond the next valley. Into this fertile ground fell seeds of story from countless sources. Celtic druids had preserved oral traditions stretching back to prehistoric times. Roman colonists had left behind fragments of classical mythology. Germanic tribes carried tales of gods and heroes from the northern forests. Viking raiders brought stories of sea monsters and distant shores. Christian monks introduced biblical narratives and saints' lives that blended seamlessly with older pagan traditions. But perhaps most importantly, the common people themselves became storytellers, transforming abstract concepts into memorable characters and situations that could be easily remembered and passed down through generations. A story about the dangers of greed became a tale of a king whose touch turned everything to gold. A lesson about the importance of hospitality transformed into adventures where disguised gods tested mortals' kindness. Let me introduce you to Marguerite, a young woman living in a small French village in the year 1150. Marguerite couldn't read or write, but she possessed something far more valuable in her world, an endless treasury of stories that had been passed down through her family for generations beyond counting. Every evening, as the sun disappeared behind the rolling hills, and shadows crept across the thatched roofs of her village. Marguerite would gather the children around the central hearth. The adults would continue their work, mending clothes or preparing tools for the next day, but their ears would tune to her voice as she began the ancient ritual of storytelling. Her repertoire included tales that had traveled impossible distances, stories that had begun in the courts of Constantinople, been carried by merchants along the Silk Road, transformed by countless retellings until they emerged in her French village bearing only faint resemblances to their origins. She knew Celtic legends of otherworldly realms where time moved differently and ordinary mortals could find themselves trapped for what seemed like days but proved to be centuries. From her grandmother, she had inherited Germanic tales of shape-shifting creatures that lived in the deep forests, beings that could appear as beautiful maidens or helpful old men, but whose true nature remained forever mysterious and potentially dangerous. These stories served practical purposes, warning children about the genuine dangers of wandering too far from safety, while also preserving ancient wisdom about respecting the natural world. Marguerite's favourite stories, however, were those that spoke to the hopes and dreams of her community. Tales of clever peasant girls who outwitted cruel nobles, of the youngest sons who proved themselves worthy through courage and kindness rather than birthright, of magical helpers who appeared to assist those pure of heart in their times of greatest need. These weren't escapist fantasies, but profound reflections of medieval social realities. In a world where social mobility seemed impossible, stories provided hope that virtue and cleverness could triumph over inherited privilege. In communities where survival depended on cooperation and mutual aid, tales emphasized the importance of kindness to strangers and respect for wisdom wherever it might be found. Consider the story of the clever peasant girl, which appeared in countless variations across medieval Europe. In Marguerite's version, a poor farmer's daughter was summoned before the local lord to answer impossible riddles. If she succeeded, her family would be freed from crushing taxes. If she failed, they would lose their land and be forced into serfdom. The riddles themselves were designed to seem unsolvable. How do you come to court neither walking nor riding, neither dressed nor naked, neither with a gift nor empty-handed? But the clever girl found solutions that satisfied the letter of each challenge, while defying their apparent intent. She arrived sitting on a goat, draped in fishing nets, carrying a bird, that she released the moment she entered the Lord's presence. This story, told and retold around countless medieval hearths, served multiple purposes simultaneously. It entertained listeners with its clever wordplay and unexpected solutions. It provided hope to those who felt powerless against arbitrary authority. It celebrated intelligence and creativity as alternatives to brute force or inherited privilege. Most subtly, it preserved ancient folk wisdom about the power of lateral thinking and the importance of questioning assumptions. But the tale operated on even deeper levels that modern audiences might miss. The riddles themselves echo ancient initiation ceremonies, tests that candidates for wisdom or spiritual advancement had to pass to prove their readiness for higher knowledge. The girl's solutions demonstrate mastery of the kind of paradoxical thinking that medieval philosophers and theologians considered essential for understanding divine mysteries. The fishing net that allowed her to be neither dressed nor naked referenced ancient symbols of spiritual transformation. The idea that true wisdom required transcending simple binary oppositions. The bird that she carried but did not give represented the soul's journey toward freedom, a concept that resonated deeply with medieval audiences who saw earthly life as preparation for spiritual liberation. As Marguerite told this story to her village audience, she was simultaneously entertaining children, instructing them in practical problem-solving skills, preserving ancient wisdom traditions, and providing adults with subtle commentaries on power, justice, and the nature of reality itself. The simple tale of a clever peasant girl contained layers of meaning that could satisfy listeners at every level of understanding. The medieval world was filled with such stories, each one serving as a vessel for multiple types of knowledge. medical knowledge was preserved in tales of magical healing springs and wise women who could cure any ailment with herbs and incantations. Astronomical observations were encoded in stories of heroes whose journeys followed the patterns of constellations across the night sky. Agricultural wisdom was embedded in tales of magical gardens and enchanted harvests that taught practical lessons about crop rotation, soil management, and the optimal timing for planting and harvesting. Even the most fantastical elements of medieval folklore served practical purposes that modern readers might not immediately recognize. Dragons, those magnificent and terrible creatures that dominated so many medieval stories, weren't arbitrary monsters invented to provide heroes with worthy opponents. They represented specific types of chaos and destruction that medieval communities genuinely feared and needed to understand. The dragon that hoarded gold and terrorized entire kingdoms embodied the destructive power of unchecked greed and the way that excessive accumulation of wealth could poison entire societies. The dragon that breathed fire and laid waste to forests and farmlands represented the ever-present threat of war, disease, and natural disasters that could destroy years of patient work in a matter of hours. The dragon that slept beneath the earth but could be awakened by human foolishness symbolized the consequences of disturbing natural balances or violating ancient taboos. When heroes in these tales faced dragons, they weren't simply engaging in exciting combat sequences. They were demonstrating the virtues and strategies that medieval people believed were necessary for confronting the various forms of chaos that threatened their communities. The successful dragon slayer typically combined physical courage with wisdom, strength with compassion, individual heroism with respect for divine guidance and community support. These dragon tales served as training manuals for leadership, teaching that true heroism required more than martial prowess. The greatest heroes were those who understood that defeating external monsters was meaningless unless one had first conquered the dragons of pride, greed, and selfishness that lurked within the human heart. The most beloved dragon tale of Marguerite's collection was that of Sir Gareth and the Crimson Worm, a story that had travelled from the monasteries of Ireland through the trading routes of medieval France. In her telling, the dragon wasn't simply a beast to be conquered, but a cursed guardian protecting a well that had once provided healing waters to an entire region. The curse had fallen upon the land when a greedy baron had tried to claim ownership of the sacred spring, driving away the holy woman who had tended it for decades. As punishment for this sacrilege, the waters turned bitter. The guardian spirit transformed into a fearsome dragon, and the surrounding countryside withered into a wasteland where nothing could grow. Sir Gareth, the youngest and supposedly weakest of his father's sons, undertook the quest not for glory or treasure, but because he had witnessed a village child dying from a plague that the healing waters could have cured. His approach to the dragon was unlike that of the knights who had failed before him. Instead of charging forward with sword and lance, Gareth spent 3 days sitting beside the poisoned well, neither eating nor drinking, simply listening to the dragon's roars and trying to understand the pain behind them. On the 3rd night, as Gareth sat in meditation, the dragon's form began to shimmer and change. The creature's voice, no longer a terrifying roar, spoke words of profound sorrow. It told of centuries spent guarding waters that could no longer heal, of watching the land grow barren while being powerless to restore its former beauty. The dragon revealed that it had once been the sacred guardian of the spring, transformed by its own grief and rage into the monster that now terrorized the region. Gareth's solution was not violence, but understanding. He recognized that the dragon's curse could only be broken by undoing the original injustice, working with the surviving relatives of the displaced holy woman. He restored the spring to its rightful guardians and established protections, ensuring it could never again be claimed by selfish interests. As the sacred rituals were renewed and the proper offerings made, the dragon's monstrous form dissolved, revealing the benevolent spirit that had always dwelled within. This transformation of the story's central conflict from combat to restoration reflected deep medieval beliefs about the relationship between justice and healing. The tale taught that many seemingly insurmountable problems weren't meant to be fought but understood, that monsters often originated from unaddressed wounds in the social fabric that required healing rather than violence. Marguerite would pause at this point in her telling, allowing the crackling of the fire and the settling of her listeners to create space for reflection. The children would lean forward, captivated by the image of a knight who conquered through compassion rather than strength. The adults would nod knowingly, recognizing parallels to conflicts in their own community that required wisdom rather than force to resolve. But the tale of Sir Gareth contained yet another layer that spoke to the spiritual concerns that dominated medieval consciousness. The poisoned well represented the human soul corrupted by sin, while the dragon embodied the suffering that resulted from separation from divine grace. Gareth's 3-day vigil echoed Christ's time in the tomb, suggesting that spiritual transformation required a kind of death to one's old understanding before resurrection into wisdom could occur. The restoration of the sacred spring symbolized the renewal of proper relationship between humanity and the divine, while the dragon's transformation back into a benevolent guardian illustrated the medieval belief that even the most fallen creatures could be redeemed through genuine repentance and the restoration of divine order. Medieval audiences would have understood these symbolic layers instinctively, their minds trained by centuries of allegorical thinking to perceive multiple meanings simultaneously. They lived in a world where every earthly event was believed to reflect spiritual realities, where stories served not merely as entertainment, but as windows into the fundamental structures of existence itself. As autumn deepened into winter in Marguerite's village, the stories would grow longer and more complex, reflecting the increased leisure time that the agricultural calendar provided once the harvest was complete. These were the months when the most profound tales emerged, stories that could sustain hours of telling and days of contemplation. One such epic was the cycle of the 7 Sleepers, a tale that wove together elements from Christian legend, Celtic otherworld myths, and ancient solar worship into a narrative that could occupy an entire week of winter evenings. The story told of 7 young nobles who had fled persecution by taking refuge in a hidden cave, only to fall into an enchanted slumber that lasted for centuries. When they finally awakened, the world had transformed beyond recognition. The pagan kingdom they remembered had become a Christian realm. Ancient forests had given way to cultivated fields, and the very language spoken by the common people had evolved into something they could barely understand. Yet their purpose remained unchanged: to serve as bridges between the old ways and the new, helping their transformed society understand which ancient wisdoms still held value and which traditions needed to be left behind. Each of the 7 sleepers brought different gifts to their awakened world. The first possessed knowledge of herbal healing that had been nearly lost to time. The second understood the movements of stars and seasons in ways that could improve agricultural practices. The third carried memories of ancient laws and customs that offered solutions to contemporary disputes. The fourth retained songs and poems that preserved the emotional wisdom of earlier generations. The 5th sleeper brought knowledge of craftsmanship and building techniques that had been forgotten during the chaos of warfare and social upheaval. The 6th understood the languages of animals and could interpret natural signs that helped predict weather patterns and seasonal changes. The 7th, and perhaps most important, possessed the ability to recognize the essential spiritual truths that remained constant despite changes in religious expression and cultural form. Together, the 7 sleepers represented the ideal relationship between tradition and innovation that medieval society constantly struggled to achieve. They demonstrated that wisdom lay not in rejecting the past entirely, nor in refusing to adapt to changing circumstances, but in discerning which elements of ancestral knowledge remained valuable and how they could be integrated with new understanding. The tale served as a metaphor for the cultural challenges that every medieval generation faced as they inherited traditions from their ancestors while confronting problems that required fresh solutions. It suggested that the deepest wisdom came not from blind adherence to custom, nor from reckless innovation, but from the careful synthesis of old and new that honored the past while serving the present. As Marguerite spun this lengthy tale across multiple evenings, her audience would find themselves drawn into philosophical discussions that might continue long after the formal storytelling had ended. Young people would debate which of the 7 gifts they would most want to possess, while their elders would share their own experiences of navigating between traditional ways and necessary changes. The story also provided a framework for understanding the rapid social transformations that characterized the medieval period. As trade routes expanded, new technologies emerged, and different cultures came into contact with each other. Medieval communities constantly faced decisions about which innovations to embrace and which traditions to preserve. The cycle of the 7 sleepers offered a model for approaching these challenges with wisdom rather than fear, suggesting that change itself could be sacred if it was guided by discernment and motivated by love for both ancestors and descendants. The tale implied that every generation had the responsibility to serve as bridges between past and future, ensuring that essential wisdom survived while allowing for the growth and adaptation that life required. These winter tales of Marguerite's served another crucial function in medieval society. They provided a sense of continuity and meaning during the darkest months of the year, when death seemed closer and hope sometimes felt fragile. The long nights of storytelling created bonds between community members that would sustain them through the challenges of survival until spring returned with its promise of renewal. The stories themselves became living things, changing slightly with each telling as new details were added or emphasis shifted to address the particular needs of each audience. A tale might emphasize courage when the community faced external threats, wisdom when difficult decisions needed to be made, or compassion when internal conflicts threatened social harmony. This flexibility ensured that medieval folklore remained vibrant and relevant across centuries of social change, each generation finding in the ancient tales exactly the guidance they needed for their unique circumstances. The stories survived, not because they were perfectly preserved in unchanging form, but because they possessed the organic vitality to grow and adapt while maintaining their essential wisdom and transformative power. This organic evolution of storytelling reached its most sophisticated expression in the great seasonal cycles that governed medieval narrative traditions. As winter deepened in Marguerite's village, the stories themselves seemed to hibernate and transform, emerging in spring with new details that reflected the community's changing understanding of their world. The tale of the weaver's daughter exemplified this living quality of medieval folklore. In its earliest known form, the story concerned a young woman whose skill at the loom attracted the attention of supernatural beings who challenged her to weave moonlight into cloth. Each time Marguerite told this tale, subtle variations emerged that reflected the particular concerns of her moment and her audience. During years when the harvest had been poor and hunger threatened the village, the weaver's supernatural challenges might offer her golden thread that could be sold to buy grain for her starving neighbors. In times of political upheaval, they might demand that she weave a tapestry depicting the future of the kingdom, forcing her to choose between revealing truths that could prevent disaster or maintaining the silence that kept her family safe. When young women in the village faced difficult marriages or uncertain futures, the weaver's dilemma might center on choosing between a supernatural lover who offered eternal youth in an otherworldly realm and a mortal husband who promised only the ordinary joys and sorrows of earthly life. Each variation addressed the immediate emotional and practical needs of Marguerite's listeners, while maintaining the story's deeper themes about creativity, sacrifice, and the relationship between human skill and divine inspiration. The weaver's loom itself carried profound symbolic weight that medieval audiences understood instinctively. It represented the way that individual lives were woven into the larger fabric of community, family, and cosmic order. The threads she worked with symbolized the various forces and influences that shaped human destiny, while her skill at combining them into beautiful patterns reflected the medieval belief that human beings were partners with the divine in creating meaning and beauty from the raw materials of existence. When the supernatural beings challenged the weaver to work with impossible materials like captured starlight or the songs of nightingales, they were testing not just her technical abilities, but her capacity to bridge the gap between earthly and heavenly realms. Success required her to develop new forms of perception and skill that transcended ordinary human limitations, while remaining grounded in the practical knowledge she had learned from generations of weavers before her. The resolution of the tale typically involved the weaver discovering that the most precious cloth she could create was woven from materials that seemed worthless to others, but possessed hidden value that only wisdom could recognize. She might create a healing shroud from nettles that had grown in cursed ground, or fashion a banner of protection from threads spun by spiders in abandoned houses where tragedy had occurred. These solutions taught medieval audiences that redemption and transformation were always possible, that even the most damaged or despised elements of existence could be transformed into sources of blessing through the application of love, skill, and divine grace. The weaver's art became a metaphor for the spiritual work that every person was called to perform, taking the mixed threads of their own experience and creating from them something beautiful that could serve their community's needs. As winter solstice approached, Marguerite's storytelling would take on an even more mystical quality, drawing upon the ancient understanding that the darkest night of the year was also the moment when light began its return. The stories told during this sacred season often concerned journeys into otherworldly realms, where different rules applied, and ordinary mortals could encounter beings of immense power and wisdom. The tale of the Night of the Hollow Hill was reserved exclusively for the 12 nights between Christmas and Epiphany, a period when medieval people believed the veil between worlds grew thin and supernatural encounters became more likely. The story began with a young knight who became lost during a fierce snowstorm while traveling to join his liege lord's Christmas court. Seeking shelter, he discovered a hill that glowed with warm light despite being covered in snow. Inside, he found a magnificent hall where creatures of fairy held their own celebration, presided over by a queen of otherworldly beauty whose crown was woven from winter stars. The fairy queen offered the knight hospitality, but warned him that accepting her food and drink would bind him to her realm, according to laws older than human memory. The knight's choice became the central tension of the tale. He could accept the fairy feast and gain access to wisdom and power beyond mortal comprehension, but at the cost of never returning to his human obligations and relationships, or he could refuse the hospitality and struggle back through the storm to his own world, maintaining his humanity, but missing the opportunity for transcendent knowledge. Different versions of the tale explored various outcomes of this choice, each carrying distinct moral and spiritual implications. In some tellings, the knight chose the fairy realm and became a bridge between worlds, carrying messages and blessings from the other world to help his former companions during times of crisis. In others, he refused the supernatural offer and found that his loyalty to earthly duties was itself a form of spiritual achievement that earned him divine protection and eventual reward. The most complex version, reserved for the most sophisticated audiences, presented a third option where the knight negotiated with the fairy queen to spend half his time in each realm, serving as a guardian of the boundary between mortal and immortal worlds. This resolution required him to develop the wisdom to know when supernatural intervention was appropriate and when human beings needed to solve their problems through their own efforts and growth. The Night of the Hollow Hill served multiple functions within the Christmas season celebration. It entertained listeners during the long winter nights, while also providing a framework for contemplating the spiritual significance of the Incarnation. The Christian teaching that divine and human natures had been united in the person of Christ. The Fairy Queen's offer paralleled the choice that medieval Christians believed every soul faced between earthly and heavenly goods, while the Knight's dilemma reflected the tension between contemplative and active spiritual paths. The story suggested that true wisdom lay not in choosing one realm over another, but in learning to serve as a bridge between them, bringing the insights gained through spiritual experience to bear on the practical challenges of mortal existence. Medieval audiences would have recognized in this tale echoes of older traditions about the wild hunt, the spectral procession that was believed to ride across the winter sky during the darkest nights of the year. But the Christian overlay transformed these pagan elements into a meditation on divine grace and human responsibility that spoke to the spiritual concerns of their own era. The seasonal nature of this storytelling created rhythms of meaning that supported medieval communities through the challenging cycles of agricultural life. Spring stories celebrated renewal and possibility, emphasizing themes of growth, courtship, and new beginnings. Summer tales often focused on adventures and quests, reflecting the season when travel was possible and young people might leave their villages to seek their fortunes in the wider world. Autumn stories frequently concerned harvest, judgment, and preparation, teaching practical wisdom about storing resources for winter, while also addressing spiritual themes about accountability and the need to gather inner resources for times of trial. Winter tales, like those we have been exploring, tended toward deeper mysteries and otherworldly encounters that reflected the season's invitation to contemplation and inner development. This cyclical approach to storytelling ensured that medieval folklore addressed the full spectrum of human experience while remaining connected to the natural rhythms that governed agricultural societies. The stories themselves became part of the seasonal celebrations that marked important transitions throughout the year, lending depth and meaning to community gatherings that might otherwise have been merely social occasions. The integration of storytelling with seasonal observances also preserved ancient knowledge about the relationship between human consciousness and natural cycles. Medieval people understood that different times of year were appropriate for different types of inner work, and their stories reflected this sophisticated understanding of how environmental changes affected human psychology and spiritual development. During the planting season, tales emphasized themes of faith and patience, teaching that the most important work often involved actions whose results would not be visible for months or years. Harvest stories celebrated the fulfillment of earlier labors while warning against the pride and complacency that success could bring. Winter narratives explored the spiritual gifts that could emerge from periods of apparent dormancy and withdrawal from external activity. This seasonal wisdom was embedded so deeply in medieval folklore that it continued to influence European culture long after the agricultural basis for these rhythms had been largely abandoned. The stories carried within them an understanding of time as cyclical rather than linear, suggesting that human life gained its deepest meaning through participation in patterns that connected individual existence to cosmic processes that extended far beyond the span of any single lifetime. Marguerite's mastery of this seasonal storytelling tradition made her an essential figure in her village's cultural and spiritual life. She served not merely as an entertainer, but as a keeper of wisdom who helped her community maintain its connection to the deeper rhythms and meanings that gave significance to their daily struggles and celebrations. Her repertoire included hundreds of tales that had been refined through countless generations of telling, each one precisely calibrated to serve specific functions within the community's ongoing life. She knew stories that could comfort the grieving, inspire the discouraged, guide the confused, and celebrate the joyful. Her art lay not merely in remembering these tales, but in knowing exactly which story was needed at each moment and how to adapt its telling to address the particular needs of her audience. This practical wisdom about the healing and transformative power of narrative represented one of medieval culture's most sophisticated achievements. a technology of the spirit that allowed communities to maintain psychological and social health across generations of challenge and change. The stories were medicines for the soul, carefully formulated to address specific ailments of the human condition, while strengthening the bonds that held communities together. As we settle deeper into these ancient rhythms of story and season, we begin to understand why medieval folklore has retained its power to enchant and instruct across the centuries that separate us from its origins. These tales speak to aspects of human experience that transcend historical circumstance, offering wisdom that remains relevant wherever people struggle to find meaning, purpose, and connection in their lives. The sophistication of medieval storytelling traditions becomes even more apparent when we consider how they address the complex social hierarchies that defined their world, while simultaneously offering hope for transcendence and transformation that could inspire people regardless of their station in life. The genius of medieval storytelling lay in its ability to speak simultaneously to peasants and nobles, to children and elders, to the devout and the questioning. These tales possessed a remarkable democratic quality that transcended the rigid social boundaries of their time, offering profound insights wrapped in language and imagery that anyone could understand and remember. Consider the story of the shepherd's crown, which Marguerite would tell during the long evenings of late winter, when the community gathered to repair tools and prepare for spring planting. This tale concerned a young shepherd who discovered a circlet of silver hidden beneath a standing stone on the hillside where he grazed his flock. The crown was beautiful beyond description, set with gems that captured starlight and held it even in daylight hours. But the moment the shepherd placed it upon his head, he could hear the thoughts of every creature within miles of his location. The sheep spoke to him of their contentment with sweet grass and their fears of wolves that prowled the forest edges. The birds shared news from distant valleys and warnings of storms approaching from beyond the mountains. More disturbing were the human voices that now filled his mind. He heard the secret thoughts of his neighbors, their hidden resentments and private shames, their unspoken loves and carefully concealed fears. The village priest wrestled with doubts about divine providence while publicly preaching certainty. The Lord's wife dreamed of escape to distant lands while maintaining the facade of contentment with her arranged marriage. The merchant who appeared prosperous was consumed with anxiety about debts that threatened to destroy his family's future. At first, this knowledge seemed like the greatest possible gift. The shepherd could anticipate the needs of his flock, predict weather changes that would affect the village, and understand the true motivations behind every human interaction. He used his insights to prevent conflicts before they erupted, to comfort those who suffered in silence, and to guide his community toward decisions that served everyone's genuine interests, rather than their stated preferences. But the burden of absolute understanding proved almost unbearable. The shepherd found himself unable to enjoy simple pleasures when he could perceive the complexity of suffering that surrounded every moment of happiness. He could no longer engage in casual conversation when he knew the speaker's real thoughts contradicted their words. The weight of carrying everyone's secrets and sorrows began to crush his spirit, leaving him isolated despite being more connected to his community than ever before. The crisis of the tale came when the shepherd realized that his supernatural knowledge was preventing him from experiencing the very human connections he had hoped to enhance. By knowing too much about others' inner lives, he had lost the ability to relate to them as fellow travelers on life's uncertain journey. His perfect understanding had paradoxically created perfect loneliness. The resolution required the shepherd to make a choice that medieval audiences would have recognized as profoundly spiritual. He could keep the crown and its gifts, accepting the isolation that came with divine-like knowledge, or he could return it to its hiding place and embrace the limitations and uncertainties of ordinary human perception. His decision to remove the crown represented not failure, but wisdom, an understanding that some gifts come at prices too high to pay. But the story's most sophisticated element was its final twist. As the shepherd replaced the crown beneath the standing stone, he discovered that his time wearing it had left him permanently changed. He could no longer hear thoughts directly, but he had developed an intuitive understanding of human nature that made him extraordinarily effective at helping others resolve their conflicts and find their paths forward. The supernatural gift had awakened natural abilities that remained even after its source was removed. This transformation reflected medieval beliefs about the relationship between divine grace and human development. Supernatural experiences were understood not as ends in themselves, but as catalysts that could awaken latent potentials within the human soul. The shepherd's brief period of omniscience had taught him lessons about compassion, humility, and the importance of accepting human limitations that made him a better leader and counselor than any amount of ordinary experience could have provided. Marguerite's telling of this tale would vary subtly, depending on the particular challenges facing her community during each winter season. In years when social tensions ran high, she might emphasize the shepherd's insights into the hidden fears that drove people to conflict with their neighbors. During periods of economic hardship, she could highlight his understanding of how private anxieties affected public behavior and decision-making. The story also served as a training manual for those who held positions of authority or influence within medieval communities. Village headmen, guild leaders, and other local officials would recognize in the shepherd's dilemma their own challenges in balancing the need for insight with the importance of maintaining appropriate boundaries in their relationships with those they served. More subtly, the tale addressed questions about the nature of wisdom itself that concerned medieval philosophers and theologians. It suggested that true understanding required not just knowledge, but the judgment to know how that knowledge should be used. The shepherd's growth from supernatural omniscience to natural wisdom paralleled the spiritual journey that medieval people believed every soul must undertake in learning to balance earthly and heavenly perspectives. The crown itself carried symbolic meanings that would have been immediately apparent to medieval audiences. As a circlet of silver set with starlight, it represented the connection between earthly authority and cosmic order that medieval political theory considered essential for legitimate rulership. The shepherd's temporary wearing of the crown suggested that true leadership came not from birth or appointment, but from the willingness to bear the burden of understanding others' needs and fears. His decision to return the crown demonstrated the humility that medieval people considered the foundation of all authentic authority. Leaders who sought power for its own sake were understood to be fundamentally corrupted, while those who accepted responsibility reluctantly and held it lightly were believed to be capable of serving the common good rather than their private interests. As spring approached and the agricultural cycle prepared to begin anew, Marguerite's storytelling would shift toward tales that emphasized renewal, growth, and the eternal return of hope after periods of darkness and difficulty. These spring stories carried within them the accumulated wisdom of winter's long contemplations, transforming the insights gained during the season of rest into practical guidance for the active months ahead. The tale of the Garden of Forgotten Dreams exemplified this transitional quality of early spring folklore. It told of a young woman who inherited a plot of land that had been abandoned for generations, so overgrown with thorns and weeds that no one remembered what might once have grown there. Previous owners had given up in despair, declaring the soil cursed and the location unsuitable for cultivation. But the young woman possessed a gift that others lacked. She could see the dreams that people had planted in the earth through their hopes and labors, even decades after those dreamers had died or moved away. Where others saw only brambles and barren ground, she perceived the ghostly outlines of magnificent gardens that had existed only in imagination, the plans and aspirations that had never been fully realized. Her first task was not to clear the existing growth, but to understand what the land itself was trying to tell her about its history and potential. She spent weeks walking the boundaries of her inheritance, learning to read the subtle signs that revealed where previous gardeners had attempted to plant roses, where they had envisioned fruit trees, where they had hoped to create spaces for rest and contemplation. Gradually, she began to perceive the deeper pattern that connected all these individual dreams into a coherent vision of what the garden could become. Each previous owner had seen only a fragment of the land's true potential, but their combined aspirations, when properly understood and integrated, revealed possibilities that none of them had imagined alone. The actual work of restoration required not just physical labor, but a form of spiritual archaeology, carefully uncovering and honoring the dreams of the past while adapting them to serve the needs of the present. Some plants that had been abandoned proved to have survived in wild forms that needed only pruning and cultivation to return to their intended beauty. Others had to be replanted using seeds that she gathered from distant locations where similar dreams had been more successfully realized. The most challenging aspect of the restoration involved learning to distinguish between dreams that were worth preserving and those that needed to be released to make room for new growth. Some previous plans had been based on unrealistic expectations or selfish desires that would have created beauty for only a few while impoverishing the surrounding community. Others had been conceived with such generosity and wisdom that they deserved to be fully realized even decades after their original dreamers had passed away. As the garden slowly returned to life under her patient care, it began to attract visitors who recognized in its emerging beauty reflections of their own hopes and aspirations. Children played among flowers that seemed to bloom in response to their laughter. Young couples found secluded corners perfect for courtship and the sharing of their own dreams for the future. Elderly visitors discovered that the garden's pathways led them through memories of their youth while offering new perspectives on the experiences that had shaped their lives. The garden's true miracle was its ability to inspire others to begin their own work of restoration and renewal. Visitors would return to their homes with seeds gathered from plants that had particularly moved them, starting smaller versions of the great garden that reflected their individual circumstances and capabilities. The young woman's work became the catalyst for a broader transformation that spread throughout the region as people rediscovered their capacity to nurture beauty and meaning in their own environments. This tale served multiple functions within the community's spring preparation rituals. It encouraged listeners to look beyond the immediate appearance of challenges and problems to perceive the potential for renewal and growth that existed even in the most unpromising circumstances. It taught practical lessons about the importance of understanding history and context before attempting to create change. Most importantly, it suggested that individual efforts to create beauty and meaning could inspire broader transformations that benefited entire communities. The Garden of Forgotten Dreams also carried deeper spiritual meanings that reflected medieval understanding of the soul's journey toward divine union. The abandoned land represented the human heart after it had been wounded by disappointment and loss. The young woman's gift for perceiving buried dreams symbolized the spiritual insight that could recognize divine potential even in apparently hopeless situations. Her work of restoration paralleled the process of spiritual renewal that medieval theologians believed was necessary for salvation. Like the gardener who had to carefully distinguish between dreams worth preserving and those that needed to be released, the soul-seeking God had to learn to discern between authentic spiritual aspirations and selfish desires disguised as religious devotion. The garden's ability to inspire others to begin their own restoration projects reflected the medieval belief that genuine spiritual achievement naturally overflowed into service to the broader community. Those who had successfully cultivated their inner lives became sources of inspiration and guidance that helped others begin their own journeys toward wholeness and purpose. As the tale concluded, Marguerite would often add verses that had been composed by local poets inspired by the story's imagery. These songs became part of the village's spring planting rituals, sung while seeds were planted and soil prepared for the growing season. The boundary between story and lived experience dissolved as the narrative's wisdom was integrated into the practical work of agricultural renewal. This integration of folklore with seasonal labor represented one of the most sophisticated achievements of medieval culture. Stories were not separate from daily life. but woven into the fabric of practical activity, providing meaning and motivation that transformed routine work into spiritual practice. The tales carried within them accumulated wisdom about timing, patience, and the relationship between human effort and natural processes that made them invaluable guides for agricultural success. The spring stories also addressed the psychological challenges of beginning new ventures after long periods of rest and contemplation. They acknowledged the fear and uncertainty that accompanied any significant undertaking, while providing hope that patient effort, guided by wisdom, could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The narrative patterns themselves served as maps for navigating the emotional landscape of renewal and growth. Medieval communities understood that stories possessed the power to shape reality by influencing the attitudes and expectations that people brought to their work and relationships. A village that regularly heard tales about the possibility of transforming abandoned land into flourishing gardens was more likely to approach their own agricultural challenges with optimism and creativity than a community that focused on narratives of failure and limitation. This understanding of story as a form of practical magic that could influence outcomes in the material world was not primitive superstition, but sophisticated psychology. Medieval people had observed that communities with rich traditions of hopeful, transformative narratives tended to be more prosperous and resilient than those whose folklore emphasized tragedy and defeat. The seasonal cycle of storytelling thus served not merely as entertainment or moral instruction, but as a technology for maintaining community morale and effectiveness across the inevitable challenges and changes that mark the passage of years. The stories provided emotional and spiritual resources that could be drawn upon during times of crisis, while also celebrating the joys and achievements that made life worth living. As we have seen through Marguerite's winter and spring repertoire, medieval folklore represented one of humanity's most successful attempts to create a sustainable culture that could nurture both individual development and community well-being across generations of change and challenge. These tales carried within them the distilled wisdom of countless lives lived in close relationship with natural cycles and cosmic rhythms that modern societies have largely forgotten. The genius of this tradition lay not in any single story, but in the complex web of narratives that provided guidance for every aspect of human experience while maintaining the flexibility to adapt to new circumstances and challenges. Each tale was both complete in itself and part of a larger pattern that reflected medieval understanding of existence as fundamentally meaningful and purposeful, despite its obvious difficulties and uncertainties. The storytellers like Marguerite who maintained these traditions served as guardians of collective wisdom, ensuring that essential insights about human nature and spiritual development were preserved and transmitted across generations. Their art represented one of the highest achievements of medieval civilization, creating bridges between past and future that allowed communities to maintain continuity while adapting to change. As the wheel of seasons continued to turn in Marguerite's village, bringing summer's abundance and autumn's harvest, the stories would continue to evolve and adapt, reflecting the eternal human need for meaning, hope, and connection that transcends any particular historical period or cultural circumstance. These medieval voices still whisper to us across the centuries, offering guidance and inspiration that remains as relevant today as it was in the flickering firelight of those long-ago winter evenings. The turning of seasons brought new challenges to medieval storytelling, as summer's arrival demanded tales that could inspire courage and adventure, while communities dispersed across fields and forests for the demanding work of cultivation and harvest. Marguerite's summer repertoire reflected this shift towards stories of journeys and quests, tales that could be shared around smaller fires during brief respites from labor, or carried in memory by those who traveled to distant markets and fairs. The most beloved of these warm-weather tales was the story of Elena the Mapmaker, a young woman whose gift for navigation came not from studying charts and instruments, but from her ability to perceive the invisible currents of desire and longing that connected all living things. In Marguerite's telling, Elena lived in a coastal village where merchants and pilgrims regularly arrived seeking guides who could lead them safely to their destinations through landscapes that seemed to shift and change according to mysterious laws. While other guides relied on familiar landmarks and well-traveled paths, Elena understood that the most direct route between two places was rarely the obvious one. She had learned through years of careful observation that the land itself possessed a kind of consciousness that responded to the intentions and needs of those who traveled across it. Forests might reveal hidden paths to those who approached with reverence and patience, while closing themselves to travelers driven by greed or malice. Elena's first great test came when a desperate father arrived at her village, seeking someone who could guide him to a legendary healing spring that was said to lie somewhere in the vast wilderness beyond the northern mountains. His daughter had fallen victim to a wasting sickness that no physician could cure, and the spring represented his last hope for saving her life. The journey would be dangerous, requiring weeks of travel through territories inhabited by wolves, bears, and more mysterious creatures that shunned human contact. Previous guides had attempted this quest and returned empty-handed, reporting that the spring was nothing more than legend, that the maps showing its location were fraudulent, that the entire enterprise was fully designed to separate desperate people from their gold. But Elena perceived something in the father's grief that others had missed, a resonance between his love for his daughter and something ancient and powerful that dwelled in the heart of the wilderness. Her preparation for the journey involved rituals that other guides would have dismissed as superstition. She fasted for 3 days while studying not conventional maps, but patterns she observed in the flight of migrating birds, the movement of clouds across the sky, and the way morning mist settled in the valleys surrounding her village. These natural phenomena revealed to her the existence of currents and pathways that existed beyond the realm of ordinary geography. The journey itself became a story within the story, as Elena led the desperate father through landscapes that seemed to respond to their presence in ways that defied rational explanation. Rivers would reveal safe crossing points just as they needed them, while dangerous animals would withdraw from their path as if acknowledging some sacred purpose in their quest. Weather patterns would shift to provide clear skies when they needed to navigate by stars, or gentle rain when their water supplies ran low. But the true test of Elena's abilities came when they reached the region where the healing spring was supposed to exist, only to find an apparently barren plateau where no water could be seen for miles in any direction. The father's faith collapsed into despair and rage as he accused Elena of leading him on a fool's errand that had cost precious days while his daughter grew closer to death with each passing hour. Elena's response revealed the deepest wisdom embedded in her gift. She explained that the spring they sought was not a physical location that could be found through conventional searching, but a manifestation of the healing power that emerged when love and faith overcame doubt and desperation. The father's journey had not been about reaching a destination, but about transforming himself into someone capable of serving as a channel for the healing his daughter needed. As Elena spoke these words, water began to bubble up from the seemingly solid rock beneath their feet, forming a crystal-clear pool that reflected not the sky above, but images of the sick daughter in her distant bed. The father understood that the spring had been there all along, waiting for him to develop the spiritual maturity necessary to perceive and access its power. His love for his daughter, purified through the trials of the journey, had become the key that unlocked the miracle he sought. The healing water they carried back to the village proved effective not because of any magical properties it possessed in itself, but because it had been gathered by someone whose heart had been transformed by the quest to obtain it. The daughter's recovery began the moment her father administered the first drops, not through supernatural intervention, but through the power of love that had been refined and focused by his willingness to undertake what seemed an impossible journey. This tale served multiple purposes within the seasonal cycle of medieval storytelling. During the active months of summer, when community members might find themselves traveling to distant markets or undertaking challenging agricultural projects, it provided a framework for understanding how difficulties and setbacks could serve spiritual purposes that were not immediately apparent. The story suggested that the most valuable treasures were often found not at the end of journeys, but within the travelers themselves, transformed by the challenges they faced and overcame. Medieval audiences would have recognized in Elena's gift a reflection of the navigational abilities that every person needed to develop in order to find their way through the moral and spiritual challenges of earthly life. Her capacity to perceive invisible currents and pathways symbolized the intuitive wisdom that could guide souls toward their ultimate spiritual destinations, despite the confusion and misdirection that characterize worldly existence. The father's transformation from desperate seeker to effective healer illustrated the medieval understanding that spiritual gifts were not arbitrary rewards, but natural consequences of inner development. Those who underwent genuine purification through trials and sacrifice found themselves capable of serving as instruments of divine grace in ways that benefited not only themselves, but their entire communities. As summer progressed toward its peak, Marguerite would introduce tales that explored the theme of abundance and its proper use. Stories that addressed the psychological and moral challenges that accompanied periods of prosperity and success. The medieval agricultural calendar meant that summer brought not only hard work, but also the first fruits of that labor, creating opportunities for both gratitude and temptation that required careful navigation. The story of the miller's generous heart exemplified this category of summer folklore. It concerned a hard-working miller whose honesty and fair dealing had earned him prosperity beyond anything his family had previously known. His mill, located beside a swift-running stream, ground the grain for dozens of villages throughout the region, providing him with steady income that allowed his family to live in comfort and security. But prosperity brought unexpected challenges that tested the miller's character in ways that poverty never had. Wealthy merchants began approaching him with offers to purchase exclusive rights to his services, promising enormous payments in exchange for agreements that would have forced smaller farmers to travel much greater distances to have their grain processed. Government officials suggested that someone of his success should contribute to various projects and causes, some legitimate but others designed primarily to enrich those who proposed them. Most troubling were the changes that prosperity began to work within the miller's own heart. He found himself calculating the profits to be gained from each transaction, comparing his success to that of his neighbors, and gradually losing the simple satisfaction he had once found in honest work well done. The abundance that should have brought him joy instead filled him with anxiety about losing what he had gained and ambition to acquire even more. The crisis came during a particularly abundant harvest season, when grain poured into his mill faster than he could process it. The storage areas overflowed, and he was forced to turn away farmers whose crops would spoil, if not ground immediately. Some of these were families he had known since childhood, people whose small plots barely provided enough grain to sustain them through the winter months. Traditional business logic suggested that he should serve his most profitable customers first, leaving the smaller farmers to find other mills, even if that meant traveling for days or accepting inferior service. But something in the miller's heart rebelled against this cold calculation, recognizing that his prosperity had been built on the trust and loyalty of the entire community rather than just its wealthiest members. His solution revealed the wisdom that medieval audiences expected from their heroes. Instead of prioritizing customers based on the size of their payments, the miller reorganized his operations to serve those whose need was greatest. First families with barely enough grain to last the winter received priority over wealthy merchants whose stores could easily absorb delays. Widows and orphans found their small quantities of grain processed immediately, while prosperous landowners learned to plan ahead and wait their turn. This policy initially seemed economically disastrous, as several large customers took their business elsewhere, claiming that the miller had become unreliable and uncommitted to serving serious commercial interests. But the long-term consequences proved the wisdom of his choice, as his reputation for fairness and compassion attracted customers from increasingly distant regions who valued integrity over mere efficiency. More importantly, the miller discovered that organizing his work around principles of justice and mercy, rather than pure profit, brought him a satisfaction and sense of purpose that mere accumulation of wealth could never provide. His prosperity became a tool for serving his community, rather than a burden that separated him from his neighbors and corrupted his relationships. The tale's resolution involved the miller's realization that true abundance could not be measured in gold or stored grain, but in the trust and gratitude of those whose lives he had touched through his generosity. When a series of poor harvests threatened the region with famine, families throughout the countryside voluntarily shared their meager stores with the miller who had served them so faithfully during prosperous times, ensuring that no one faced starvation. This story addressed one of the central moral challenges that medieval society faced as trade expanded and new forms of wealth creation became possible. The emergence of a merchant class and the growth of market economies created opportunities for prosperity that had been unimaginable during earlier periods when most people lived at subsistence levels. But this new wealth also brought temptations and moral complexities that required careful navigation. Medieval audiences understood that prosperity could be either a blessing or a curse, depending on how it was acquired and used. Wealth that came through honest labor and was shared generously with the community could strengthen social bonds and increase overall well-being. But riches gained through exploitation or hoarded selfishly could corrupt both individuals and entire societies, creating divisions and resentments that undermine the cooperation necessary for collective survival. The miller's generous heart provided a template for navigating these challenges that emphasized service to community over individual accumulation. It suggested that those who achieved economic success had corresponding obligations to use their advantages for the benefit of others, particularly the most vulnerable members of society who lacked the resources to compete effectively in market systems. The story also explored the psychological dimension of wealth, recognizing that prosperity often created internal conflicts between gratitude and greed, satisfaction and ambition, that could be more challenging to resolve than the external problems of poverty. The miller's journey from simple contentment through anxious accumulation to purposeful generosity mapped the spiritual development that medieval people believed was necessary for anyone who hoped to handle worldly success without being corrupted by it. As summer reached its height and the first harvest festivals began, Marguerite would introduce tales that celebrated the fruits of patient labor while warning against the pride and complacency that success could bring. These stories acknowledged the legitimate joy that came from seeing dreams realized and hard work rewarded, while maintaining awareness that every achievement was temporary and that true security lay not in external circumstances, but in inner qualities that could survive any reversal of fortune. The tale of the master carpenter perfectly captured this balance between celebration and humility. It told of a craftsman whose skill at creating beautiful and functional objects from wood had earned him recognition throughout the region and commissions from nobles and merchants who competed to possess examples of his artistry. His workshop had grown from a simple shed behind his cottage into a complex of buildings where apprentices learned the techniques that had made him famous. But success brought challenges that tested not just his technical abilities, but his understanding of what made his work truly valuable. Wealthy patrons began demanding increasingly elaborate and expensive pieces that showcased their status rather than serving practical purposes. Young apprentices, attracted by stories of his prosperity, arrived expecting to learn shortcuts to success rather than embracing the patient discipline that mastery required. Most troubling was the gradual change in his own relationship to his craft. Work that had once brought him deep satisfaction began to feel routine and mechanical. The creative inspiration that had driven his finest achievements seemed to diminish as external pressures and commercial considerations increasingly dominated his attention. He found himself creating objects that met his customers' specifications, but failed to embody the vision and passion that had originally motivated his pursuit of excellence. The turning point came when a simple village priest commissioned him to create a set of altar furnishings for a small church that served one of the poorest communities in the region. The priest could offer only modest payment, barely enough to cover the cost of materials, but something in his humble sincerity awakened the carpenter's dormant enthusiasm for his craft. Working on this project, the carpenter rediscovered the meditative quality that had originally drawn him to woodworking. Without the pressure to impress wealthy patrons or demonstrate his technical virtuosity, he found himself able to focus entirely on the essential qualities that made his work meaningful: the beauty of natural wood grain, the satisfaction of joints that fit together perfectly, the way properly designed objects seem to enhance rather than dominate their surroundings. The altar furnishings he created for the poor church became his masterpiece, embodying a simplicity and spiritual power that surpassed anything he had produced for his wealthiest customers. Word of their extraordinary quality spread throughout the region, attracting visitors who came not to purchase similar work, but simply to experience the sense of peace and reverence that the pieces somehow conveyed. This experience taught the carpenter that true mastery lay not in accumulating techniques or satisfying customers, but in maintaining connection to the deeper purposes that made craftsmanship a form of spiritual practice. His subsequent work, whether for rich or poor patrons, reflected this understanding, combining technical excellence with the kind of authentic inspiration that could only emerge from genuine love for the craft itself. The tale concluded with the carpenter's decision to restructure his workshop around principles that prioritized quality over quantity, meaning over mere profit. He reduced the number of commissions he accepted, choosing projects based on their potential to challenge his creativity and serve genuine human needs, rather than simply display wealth or status. His apprentices learned not just technical skills, but the attitudes and disciplines that could sustain artistic vision throughout a lifetime of changing circumstances. This story provided medieval audiences with a framework for understanding how success in any field could be maintained without corruption of the values and motivations that had originally made achievement possible. The carpenter's journey from initial success through spiritual crisis to mature mastery reflected the development that medieval people believed was necessary for anyone who hoped to use their talents in service of lasting purposes rather than temporary satisfactions. The emphasis on craftsmanship as spiritual practice resonated deeply with medieval guild culture, where artisans understood their work as participation in divine creativity rather than merely economic activity. The carpenter's rediscovery of his craft's sacred dimensions provided a model for maintaining this perspective, even as commercial pressures and social expectations threatened to reduce art to commodity. Medieval audiences would also have recognized in this tale reflections of monastic teachings about the relationship between worldly success and spiritual development. The carpenter's experience of losing connection to his deeper motivations paralleled the spiritual dryness that monks believed could result from excessive focus on external achievements rather than inner cultivation. His recovery through service to the poor church illustrated the medieval conviction that genuine fulfillment came through dedication to purposes larger than personal advancement. The carpenter's masterpiece emerged not from pursuit of fame or wealth, but from willingness to serve a community that could offer little beyond gratitude and the opportunity to practice his craft in its purest form. As the summer season progressed toward autumn, these tales of prosperity and its proper use would gradually give way to stories that prepared communities for the challenges of harvest time and the approaching return of winter's contemplative season. The themes would shift toward gathering and preservation, both of material resources and spiritual insights, as medieval people understood that survival depended on storing not just grain and other necessities, but the wisdom and community bonds that would sustain them through the dark months ahead. The cyclical nature of this storytelling tradition ensured that each season's tales built upon insights developed during previous periods, while preparing audiences for the specific challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. Summer stories of journey and achievement provided courage and inspiration for the active months, while autumn narratives would focus on themes of harvest, judgment, and the transformation of experience into wisdom. Marguerite's mastery of these seasonal transitions made her an essential guide for her community's emotional and spiritual journey through the agricultural year. Her stories provided not just entertainment, but practical wisdom about timing, patience, and the relationship between individual effort and collective well-being that helped ensure both material prosperity and social harmony. The sophisticated psychology embedded in these traditional narratives represented one of medieval culture's most remarkable achievements, creating a technology of the spirit that could maintain community resilience and individual motivation across generations of challenge and change. These tales carried within them accumulated insights about human nature that remained as relevant to Marguerite's audiences as they had been to countless previous generations who had gathered around winter fires to hear stories that could sustain hope and purpose through the longest nights. As we continue our journey through this rich tradition of medieval folklore, we begin to understand why these ancient voices still speak to contemporary hearts seeking meaning, connection, and guidance for navigating life's eternal challenges. The wisdom embedded in these tales transcends historical circumstance, offering insights about courage, compassion, and the pursuit of authentic purpose that remain as vital today as they were in those candlelit halls where Marguerite first shared them with her grateful community. The approaching harvest season would bring new stories that explored themes of completion, judgment, and the transformation of labor into lasting value, continuing the eternal cycle of narrative wisdom that helped medieval communities maintain their connection to the deeper rhythms and meanings that gave significance to their daily struggles and celebrations. As autumn's first whispers began to touch the edges of summer's warmth, Marguerite's storytelling would undergo its most profound transformation of the year. The tales she shared during this liminal season carried the weight of both completion and preparation, addressing the complex emotions that accompanied the end of growing cycles and the approach of winter's introspective darkness. The story that marked this seasonal transition was the Chronicle of the Harvest Moon, a tale that had been shaped by generations of telling until it perfectly captured the bittersweet nature of endings that were also beginnings. It concerned a young farmer named Thomas, who had inherited land that had been in his family for generations, soil that had been tended by his ancestors with devotion that bordered on reverence. Thomas possessed unusual sensitivity to the rhythms of growing things, an intuitive understanding that allowed him to sense when crops were ready for harvest, not through conventional signs, but through subtle changes in the very atmosphere of his fields. Other farmers would examine grain heads and test soil moisture, but Thomas could feel the moment of perfect ripeness as a shift in the quality of silence that surrounded his growing plants. This gift served him well during most seasons, allowing him to bring in harvests of exceptional quality that commanded premium prices at local markets. But the autumn of his 30th year brought challenges that tested abilities he didn't know he possessed. A series of late summer storms had damaged crops throughout the region, and many farmers faced the prospect of insufficient harvests that would leave their families vulnerable during the approaching winter months. Thomas discovered that his gift extended beyond perceiving the readiness of his own crops to understanding the spiritual condition of the entire agricultural community. He could sense the despair of neighbors whose fields had been devastated by hail, the anxiety of young families facing their first difficult winter, the resignation of elderly farmers who wondered if they had strength to endure another season of uncertainty. More troubling was his growing awareness that the land itself was somehow wounded by the collective grief and fear of those who depended upon it for survival. The soil that had always seemed alive and responsive to his care now felt heavy with sorrow. as if the earth were absorbing and reflecting the emotional distress of the human community it supported. The crisis deepened when Thomas realized that his own exceptional harvest, while providing security for his immediate family, stood in stark contrast to his neighbors' struggles in ways that created resentment and division within the community. Some viewed his success with suspicion, wondering if he possessed knowledge or advantages that he was selfishly withholding from others. Others approached him with desperate requests for assistance that he lacked resources to fulfill adequately. Thomas found himself caught between competing obligations that seemed impossible to reconcile. His responsibility to his own family demanded that he preserve their harvest to ensure survival through what promised to be a difficult winter. But his awareness of community suffering made it increasingly difficult to enjoy his good fortune, while others faced genuine hardship through no fault of their own. The solution that emerged reflected wisdom that had been embedded in the tale through centuries of refinement by storytellers who understood the eternal challenge of balancing individual security with collective responsibility. Thomas began to perceive that his unusual harvest was not simply personal good fortune, but a resource that had been entrusted to him for the benefit of the entire community. Rather than distributing his surplus randomly or according to emotional appeals, Thomas developed a systematic approach that addressed both immediate needs and long-term community resilience. He identified families whose situations were most desperate and provided them with enough grain to survive the winter, but structured these gifts as loans that could be repaid through labor during the following growing season. This arrangement served multiple purposes that demonstrated the sophisticated social psychology embedded in medieval folklore. It preserved the dignity of recipients by avoiding the humiliation of outright charity, while creating bonds of mutual obligation that would strengthen community cooperation during the challenging months ahead. The promise of future labor provided hope and purpose to those who might otherwise have fallen into despair. More subtly, Thomas's approach recognized that communities survived difficult periods, not through individual heroism, but through networks of reciprocal support that could distribute both resources and responsibilities among all members. His harvest became the catalyst for creating new forms of cooperation that would benefit everyone, regardless of their immediate circumstances. The tale's most profound insight concerned Thomas's discovery that his gift for sensing the readiness of crops was actually a manifestation of deeper abilities to perceive and respond to the needs of living systems, whether agricultural or social. His sensitivity to the spiritual condition of soil and plants extended naturally to understanding the emotional and practical requirements of human communities. As winter approached and the new arrangements proved their worth, Thomas found that his relationships with neighbors had been transformed from mere proximity into genuine interdependence, based on mutual respect and shared commitment to collective survival. The community that emerged from this crisis was stronger and more resilient than the collection of individual families that had existed before the challenging harvest season. Medieval audiences would have recognized in this tale a reflection of their own experiences with the uncertainties of agricultural life and the importance of maintaining community bonds that could provide security when individual resources proved insufficient. The story provided a template for navigating the moral complexities that accompanied any distribution of scarce resources during difficult times. The Chronicle of the Harvest Moon also addressed deeper spiritual themes that reflected medieval understanding of stewardship and divine providence. Thomas's exceptional harvest was presented not as random good fortune, but as a test of his character and wisdom, an opportunity to demonstrate the qualities that made him worthy of the abundance he had received. His initial struggle with conflicting obligations paralleled the moral challenges that medieval people believed every soul faced when confronted with opportunities to serve purposes larger than immediate self-interest. The tale suggested that true prosperity could only be maintained through willingness to use individual advantages for collective benefit. The transformation of his gift from personal ability into community resource reflected medieval beliefs about the relationship between individual talents and social responsibility. those who possessed exceptional capabilities were understood to be obligated to use them in service of the common good, rather than merely for personal advancement. As autumn deepened and harvest work intensified throughout Marguerite's village, she would introduce tales that explored the theme of transformation, stories that addressed the psychological and spiritual changes that accompanied the end of agricultural cycles and the approach of winter's contemplative season. These narratives helped community members process the complex emotions associated with completion and prepare for the different types of inner work that the dark months would require. The tale of the vintner's daughter exemplified this category of autumn folklore. It concerned a young woman named Catherine, whose family had tended vineyards for generations, developing expertise in the mysterious art of transforming simple grapes into wine that could preserve the essence of summer sunshine throughout the darkest months of winter. Catherine possessed an unusual sensitivity to the subtle processes of fermentation, an intuitive understanding that allowed her to perceive when grapes had reached the perfect moment for harvesting, and how different combinations of fruit from various vineyard sections could be blended to create wines of exceptional complexity and character. Her abilities went beyond technical knowledge to encompass what medieval people would have recognized as a form of natural magic. But Catherine's gift brought challenges that tested her understanding of transformation itself. She discovered that the same sensitivity that made her exceptional at winemaking also made her acutely aware of the emotional and spiritual conditions of those around her. She could sense when neighbors were struggling with grief, anxiety, or despair as clearly as she could detect the readiness of grapes for harvest. This expanded awareness initially seemed like a burden, as Catherine found herself overwhelmed by the collective sorrows and fears of her community. The approaching winter brought not just the usual concerns about survival and security, but deeper anxieties about meaning and purpose that intensified during the dark months when outdoor work was impossible and people were forced to confront their inner lives. The crisis came when Catherine realized that her winemaking abilities were somehow connected to her capacity for perceiving and transforming emotional suffering. The finest vintages she produced seemed to carry within them not just the essence of grapes and sunshine, but something that could comfort hearts and restore hope to those who had lost connection to life's deeper meanings. This discovery forced Catherine to confront questions about the nature of her gift and the responsibilities that accompanied it. Was she meant to use her abilities simply to produce exceptional wine for her family's commercial success? Or did her talents serve larger purposes that required different approaches to her craft? The resolution involved Catherine's recognition that true mastery of fermentation required understanding transformation as a universal principle that applied to emotional and spiritual processes, as well as the conversion of grape juice into wine. Her role was not simply to produce beverages, but to serve as a catalyst for the kinds of inner changes that could help her community navigate the challenges of existence with greater wisdom and resilience. She began to approach her winemaking as a form of healing practice, selecting and blending grapes with careful attention to the emotional needs of those who would eventually consume her products. Wine intended for wedding celebrations carried different energetic qualities than vintages designed to comfort the grieving or strengthen the courage of those facing difficult decisions. This approach required Catherine to develop new forms of knowledge that combined practical expertise with intuitive understanding of human psychology and spiritual development. She learned to perceive how different vineyard locations and grape varieties could contribute specific qualities that addressed particular types of emotional or spiritual need. The wines she produced using these methods became renowned, not just for their exceptional taste, but for their capacity to facilitate the kinds of conversations and connections that strengthened community bonds and helped individuals process their experiences more effectively. Gatherings where her wine was served seemed to naturally evolve into opportunities for sharing wisdom, resolving conflicts, and celebrating the relationships that made life meaningful. Medieval audiences would have understood Catherine's gift as a reflection of the alchemical principles that governed all forms of transformation, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual. Her ability to facilitate fermentation in grapes paralleled the capacity that certain individuals possessed to catalyze positive changes in human consciousness and social relationships. The tale also addressed medieval understanding of the relationship between craft and calling, suggesting that true mastery in any field required recognition of how technical skills could serve purposes beyond mere commercial success. Catherine's evolution from skilled vintner to community healer illustrated the spiritual development that medieval people believed was necessary for anyone who hoped to use their talents in service of lasting values. As the harvest season reached its culmination and communities throughout medieval Europe prepared for winter's approach, Marguerite would share tales that explored themes of preservation and preparation. Stories that addressed both the practical challenges of storing resources and the psychological work of maintaining hope and purpose during the dark months ahead. The most profound of these autumn tales was the legend of the Keeper of Seeds, which told of an elderly woman named Agnes who had spent her entire adult life collecting, preserving, and sharing the seeds that maintained agricultural diversity throughout her region. Her modest cottage was filled with carefully labeled containers holding varieties of grains, vegetables, and herbs that had been developed by countless generations of farmers and gardeners. Agnes possessed knowledge that went far beyond simple preservation techniques to encompass understanding of which plant varieties were best suited to different soil conditions, climate patterns, and human needs. She could predict which seeds would thrive during wet years and which would survive drought, which varieties produced the most nutritious food, and which offered the best medicinal properties. But Agnes's true gift lay in her understanding of seeds as carriers of possibility, rather than merely preserved plant material. She recognized that each variety represented accumulated wisdom about adaptation and survival that had been developed through centuries of careful selection and cultivation by farmers who faced challenges similar to those confronting contemporary communities. Her collection included varieties that had been nearly lost during periods of warfare and social upheaval, rescued by farmers who understood that agricultural diversity was essential for long-term survival. Some seeds carried genetic traits that provided resistance to specific diseases or pests, while others had been selected for their ability to thrive in marginal soils or extreme weather conditions. Agnes served as more than a repository of genetic material. She functioned as a library of agricultural wisdom that connected contemporary farmers with the accumulated experience of their predecessors. When young farmers faced unfamiliar challenges, they could consult with Agnes to learn about varieties and techniques that had proven successful under similar conditions in the past. The crisis of the tale emerged when Agnes realized that her knowledge was not being adequately transmitted to younger generations, who seemed increasingly focused on immediate productivity rather than long-term sustainability. Many farmers had begun relying on a small number of high-yielding varieties that provided excellent short-term results, but reduced the genetic diversity that communities needed to adapt to changing conditions. Agnes understood that this trend threatened not just agricultural security, but the preservation of wisdom traditions that had sustained human communities for millennia. Each lost variety represented the disappearance of knowledge about specific adaptations and survival strategies that might prove essential during future challenges. Her response demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of education and cultural transmission that characterized the most profound medieval folklore. Rather than simply lecturing younger farmers about the importance of diversity, Agnes began organizing seasonal gatherings where experienced growers could share stories about different varieties and the circumstances that had led to their development. These gatherings combined practical education with social celebration, creating opportunities for farmers to learn about unfamiliar varieties while strengthening the community bonds that made cooperation possible during difficult times. Participants would bring samples of their own seeds to share, along with stories about their family's experiences with different crops and growing techniques. The seed exchanges that emerged from these gatherings served multiple purposes that reflected medieval understanding of how knowledge and resources could be preserved across generations. They maintained genetic diversity by encouraging farmers to experiment with new varieties, while also preserving traditional knowledge by creating contexts where experienced growers could share their expertise with younger community members. More subtly, the gatherings helped maintain awareness that agricultural success depended on cooperation between individual farmers rather than competition that might lead to the hoarding of knowledge or resources. The seed sharing created networks of mutual support that could provide assistance during crop failures or other emergencies. The tale concluded with Agnes's recognition that her role had evolved from simply preserving seeds to catalyzing the kinds of relationships and knowledge-sharing practices that could ensure the preservation of agricultural wisdom across future generations. Her collection became the foundation for a community-wide commitment to maintaining the diversity and resilience that would be necessary for long-term survival. Medieval audiences would have understood this story as addressing concerns that extended far beyond agriculture to encompass the preservation of all forms of traditional knowledge during periods of rapid social change. Agnes's work paralleled the efforts of monks who preserved classical texts, craftsmen who maintained traditional techniques, and storytellers like Marguerite who ensured the survival of folklore wisdom. The emphasis on seeds as carriers of possibility resonated with medieval understanding of potential and actualization that drew upon both Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology. Each seed represented a form of dormant life that required proper conditions to manifest its inherent possibilities, paralleling the spiritual development that every human soul was believed capable of achieving. Agnes's role as facilitator of knowledge transmission reflected medieval beliefs about the responsibilities of those who possessed specialized expertise to ensure its preservation for future generations. Her evolution from individual collector to community catalyst illustrated the social dimensions of wisdom that required active cultivation rather than passive preservation. As winter's approach became undeniable and the last harvest work was completed, Marguerite's storytelling would shift toward tales that prepared her community for the contemplative season ahead. These final autumn narratives explored themes of completion and new beginning, addressing the psychological transitions that accompanied the end of agricultural cycles and the return to indoor activities that characterized medieval winter life. The most significant of these transitional tales was the story of the Weaver of Seasons, which concerned a mysterious figure who appeared in different communities throughout the region as each agricultural year reached its conclusion. This weaver possessed the ability to create tapestries that captured not just the visual appearance of the passing season, but its essential spirit and meaning. The weaver would arrive in each village as harvest work was ending, carrying simple tools and materials that seemed inadequate for the magnificent works that emerged from their use. Local residents would initially view the stranger with suspicion, uncertain about the purposes behind the unusual craft practice, and wary of disrupting established routines during the busy transition period between harvest and winter preparation. But as the weaver began their work, using threads spun from local plants and dyed with colors extracted from regional soils and minerals, community members would find themselves drawn into the creative process in ways that transformed their understanding of their own experiences and environment. The emerging tapestry revealed patterns and meanings in the agricultural cycle that had been invisible when viewed from within the midst of daily labor and immediate concerns. The weaver's gift lay not simply in technical skill, but in the ability to perceive and represent the deeper significance of seasonal transitions and agricultural rhythms. The tapestries they created served as mirrors that reflected back to communities their own wisdom and achievements, while also revealing possibilities for growth and development that might otherwise have remained hidden. Each community's tapestry was unique, reflecting the specific challenges and opportunities that had characterized their particular experience of the agricultural year. But common themes emerged that spoke to universal aspects of human experience. The relationship between patience and fulfillment, the way that individual efforts contributed to collective prosperity, the transformation of simple materials into sources of nourishment and beauty. The most profound aspect of the weaver's art was its capacity to help community members recognize their own participation in processes that connected them to cosmic rhythms and eternal purposes that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. The tapestries revealed agricultural work as a form of collaboration with natural forces that reflected divine creativity and order. As winter settled over the medieval landscape and communities gathered around their fires for the long season of storytelling ahead, these autumn tales would provide the foundation for deeper explorations of meaning and purpose that characterized the contemplative months. The themes of transformation, preservation, and preparation would evolve into more complex meditations on mortality, spirituality, and the eternal questions that occupied human consciousness during the dark nights when external activity was limited and inner life demanded attention. Marguerite's mastery of these seasonal transitions ensured that her community approached each phase of the agricultural and spiritual year with appropriate preparation and understanding. Her stories served as guides that helped individuals and families navigate the emotional and psychological challenges associated with the cycles of growth, harvest, and renewal that governed medieval existence. The sophisticated wisdom embedded in these traditional narratives represented one of humanity's most successful attempts to create meaning and maintain hope in the face of uncertainty and change. These tales carried within them insights about resilience, adaptation, and the cultivation of inner resources that remained as relevant to contemporary audiences as they had been to the medieval communities that first shaped and preserved them. As our journey through this rich tradition of seasonal storytelling continues, we begin to understand how these ancient voices speak to eternal human needs for connection, purpose, and guidance that transcend historical circumstance. The wisdom preserved in medieval folklore offers resources for navigating life's challenges that remain as valuable today as they were in those firelit halls where Marguerite first shared them with her grateful community, creating bonds of understanding and hope that could sustain human spirits through the longest nights and most difficult seasons. The deepest winter nights in Marguerite's village brought forth the most mysterious tales, stories that seemed to emerge from the very darkness itself, like whispers from the other world. These were the narratives reserved for the longest evenings, when snow lay thick upon the thatched roofs, and the wind carried voices that might have belonged to spirits, or merely to distant memories stirring in the collective heart of the community. Among the most treasured of these midwinter tales was the Chronicle of the Dream Merchant, a story that had travelled from the monasteries of distant mountains through trading routes that existed more in imagination than on any earthly map. It concerned a peculiar figure who appeared in villages during the deepest part of winter, carrying nothing more than a worn leather satchel and an understanding of human longing that seemed to penetrate the very soul. The dream merchant possessed no ordinary wares to trade. Instead, he dealt in the currency of sleeping visions, offering to exchange the nightmares that plagued restless sleepers for dreams of such beauty and meaning that they could sustain hope through the darkest months. His arrival in any village was marked not by the ringing of bells or the calling of town criers, but by a subtle shift in the quality of sleep that settled over the community like a gentle blessing. Those who encountered the dream merchant discovered that he could perceive the contents of their nightly visions with startling clarity, understanding not just the surface imagery, but the deeper fears and desires that shaped the landscape of their unconscious minds. He spoke of dreams as living things that could grow and change according to the attention and intention brought to them by their dreamers. The merchant's method was both simple and profound. He would listen carefully as troubled sleepers described the visions that tormented their rest, then offer to take these dark dreams into his own keeping in exchange for carefully selected visions that could provide guidance, comfort, or inspiration according to each person's particular needs. The transaction was never completed through payment of coin or goods, but through acts of kindness or courage that demonstrated the dreamer's commitment to transforming their waking life as well as their sleeping hours. A widow who had been haunted by visions of her deceased husband's suffering found herself dreaming instead of gardens where they walked together in peaceful conversation, sharing wisdom about love that transcended the boundaries of mortality. A young man tormented by nightmares of failure and inadequacy began experiencing dreams where he appeared as a skilled craftsman, creating objects of extraordinary beauty that brought joy to entire communities. But the dream merchant's most remarkable gift was his ability to weave individual dreams into collective visions that strengthened the bonds between community members. Neighbors who had been divided by petty disputes discovered that they shared similar hopes and fears in their sleeping minds, leading to reconciliations that seemed to emerge naturally from their enhanced understanding of each other's inner lives. The tale's complexity deepened as it explored the relationship between dreams and waking reality in ways that reflected medieval understanding of consciousness as existing on multiple levels. Simultaneously, the merchant explained that dreams were not mere fantasies or random neural activity, but communications from aspects of the soul that possessed wisdom unavailable to ordinary waking consciousness. Those who worked with the dream merchant learned to approach their sleeping hours as opportunities for receiving guidance and insight that could inform their daily decisions and long-term life directions. Dreams became a form of prayer and meditation that connected individual consciousness to sources of wisdom that existed beyond the limitations of personal experience and rational understanding. The most profound transformations occurred among those who learned to become dream merchants themselves, developing the ability to perceive and influence the quality of sleep within their families and communities. These individuals discovered that the boundary between sleeping and waking consciousness was far more permeable than they had previously understood, and that intentional work with dreams could create positive changes that manifested in all aspects of life. Medieval audiences would have recognized in this tale reflections of their own understanding of dreams as messages from divine sources or communications with deceased ancestors who continued to guide their descendants from beyond the veil of mortality. The dream merchant's ability to transform nightmares into beneficial visions paralleled the spiritual work that monks and mystics performed in transforming suffering into wisdom through contemplation and prayer. The story also addressed the community dimensions of psychological and spiritual health, suggesting that individual well-being was intimately connected to the collective emotional and spiritual condition of the entire social group. The merchant's work with shared dreams reflected medieval beliefs about the interconnectedness of all human consciousness and the possibility of healing that could ripple outward from transformed individuals to benefit entire communities. As the winter nights stretched toward their greatest length, Marguerite would introduce tales that explored the theme of hidden wisdom, stories that addressed the ways in which the most profound truths often remained concealed beneath surface appearances until seekers developed the perception and courage necessary to recognize and embrace them. These narratives prepared listeners for the spiritual work that the deepest part of winter demanded, when external activity reached its minimum and inner development could proceed with maximum intensity. The tale of the Library of Unwritten Books exemplified this category of midwinter folklore. It concerned a scholar named Brother Marcus, who had devoted his life to copying and preserving manuscripts in a monastery renowned throughout the region for its extensive collection of religious and philosophical texts. His skill with pen and parchment was matched by his profound love for learning and his dedication to ensuring that knowledge would survive the various disasters that periodically threatened civilized society. But Marcus harbored a secret longing that he dared not express to his fellow monks or his abbot. Among all the volumes he had copied and studied, he sensed the existence of books that had never been written, stories and teachings that existed in some realm of pure potential, but had never found expression through human authors. These unwritten works seemed to call to him during his hours of solitary labor, tantalizing him with glimpses of wisdom that surpassed anything contained in the monastery's physical collection. The crisis of the tale emerged when Marcus discovered that his ability to perceive these unwritten books was growing stronger, to the point where he could sometimes see their contents more clearly than the texts he was supposedly copying. The invisible library that existed alongside the monastery's visible collection contained works of such profound beauty and insight that they made even the most celebrated classical authors seem limited by comparison. Marcus found himself torn between his duty to preserve existing knowledge and his growing conviction that his true calling was to serve as a scribe for the unwritten wisdom that sought expression through human consciousness. The conflict intensified when he realized that accessing this hidden library required him to develop forms of perception and spiritual discipline that went beyond anything taught in conventional monastic training. His solution revealed the sophisticated understanding of creativity and inspiration that characterized the most profound medieval folklore. Marcus began to approach his conventional copying work as a form of meditation that could prepare his consciousness for receiving the unwritten texts that existed in potential form. Each letter he inscribed became an act of devotion that opened his awareness to sources of wisdom that transcended ordinary authorship. Gradually, Marcus learned to serve as a bridge between the visible and invisible libraries, allowing the unwritten books to find expression through his careful transcription while maintaining the appearance of conventional scholarly work. The manuscripts he produced during this period appeared to be copies of existing texts, but closer examination revealed subtle additions and modifications that enhanced their meaning and spiritual power in ways that seemed to emerge naturally from the original author's intentions. The most remarkable aspect of Marcus's work was its capacity to inspire similar experiences in other readers and scribes throughout the monastic community. Those who studied the texts he had transcribed found themselves gaining access to insights and understanding that seemed to exceed what the written words alone could convey. The books became living teachings that continued to evolve and deepen according to the needs and capabilities of their readers. Medieval audiences would have understood Marcus's gift as a reflection of the relationship between human creativity and divine inspiration that was central to their understanding of all authentic artistic and intellectual achievement. His ability to perceive and transcribe unwritten books paralleled the experiences of visionary saints and mystics who received direct communications from spiritual sources that transcended ordinary human knowledge. The tale also explored the tension between institutional authority and individual spiritual experience that characterized much of medieval religious life. Marcus's secret work with the invisible library reflected the challenges faced by anyone whose direct spiritual insights seemed to conflict with established doctrine or conventional approaches to religious practice. The resolution suggested that true wisdom lay not in choosing between visible and invisible sources of knowledge, but in learning to integrate both forms of awareness in service of deeper understanding and more effective spiritual practice. Marcus's evolution from conventional scribe to bridge between worlds illustrated the spiritual development that medieval people believed was possible for anyone willing to undertake the disciplined inner work that authentic mystical experience required. As winter reached its deepest point, and communities throughout medieval Europe observed the festivals and rituals that marked the return of light to the darkened world, Marguerite's storytelling would achieve its most profound and transformative expression. These were the nights when the most sacred tales emerged, stories that had been preserved across centuries, not merely as entertainment, but as vehicles for spiritual transmission that could awaken dormant potentials within human consciousness. The master narrative of this season was the cycle of the eternal return, an epic tale that could occupy an entire week of winter evenings and left listeners with a sense of having participated in mysteries that connected their individual lives to cosmic processes of death and renewal that governed all existence. The story began with the image of a great wheel that turned slowly through the heavens, marking the passage of ages and the transformation of civilizations according to laws that transcended human understanding. Upon this wheel rode figures that represented different aspects of human experience and spiritual development. The young seeker embodied the restless energy and idealistic hopes that characterize the beginning of any spiritual journey. The wise teacher carried the accumulated insights of those who had traveled far along the path of understanding. The compassionate healer possessed the ability to transform suffering into wisdom through the application of love and skill. The silent guardian protected the sacred knowledge that could only be transmitted to those who had demonstrated readiness through their dedication and sacrifice. Each revolution of the wheel brought these archetypal figures into different relationships with each other and with the communities they served, creating opportunities for learning and growth that reflected the eternal patterns governing individual and collective development. The cycle revealed how apparent endings were actually beginnings in disguise, how periods of apparent stagnation were necessary preparations for new phases of growth, and how the greatest challenges often contained the seeds of the most profound transformations. The young seeker's portion of the cycle began with the awakening of spiritual longing that could no longer be satisfied by conventional achievements or material pleasures. This figure embarked upon journeys that led through landscapes both external and internal, encountering teachers and challenges that gradually revealed the illusory nature of the separations and limitations that had previously defined their understanding of reality. The Wise Teachers section explored the responsibilities and challenges that accompanied the acquisition of genuine spiritual insight. This figure had to learn how to communicate transcendent understanding in forms that could be received and integrated by those who remained bound by conventional perceptions, while avoiding the pride and attachment that could corrupt even the most authentic spiritual achievement. The compassionate healer's part of the cycle addressed the practical application of spiritual wisdom in service of alleviating the various forms of suffering that characterized human existence. This figure developed the ability to perceive the spiritual causes of physical and emotional ailments while learning to work with natural and supernatural forces in ways that could restore harmony and wholeness to individuals and communities. The silent guardian's portion concerned the preservation and protection of sacred knowledge during periods when external circumstances made its open expression dangerous or inappropriate. This figure learned to serve as a repository of wisdom that could survive social upheavals and cultural transformations, ensuring that essential teachings would remain available when conditions became favorable for their renewed expression. The genius of the cycle of the eternal return lay in its demonstration that these archetypal roles were not fixed identities, but stations that every soul might occupy at different stages of spiritual development. The young seeker contained within them the potential to become the wise teacher who would eventually transform into the compassionate healer, who might ultimately serve as the silent guardian who protected wisdom for future generations of seekers. The cycle also revealed how individual spiritual development was intimately connected to collective evolution, suggesting that personal transformation served larger purposes that contributed to the gradual awakening of human consciousness as a whole. Each person's journey along the wheel of spiritual development created ripples of influence that could inspire and assist others who were ready to begin their own quests for authentic understanding and genuine fulfillment. Medieval audiences would have recognized in this epic narrative reflections of their own understanding of pilgrimage, both literal and metaphorical, as the fundamental structure of human existence. The wheel's eternal turning paralleled the seasonal cycles that governed agricultural life, while also representing the spiritual rhythms that determined individual and collective destiny according to divine plan and cosmic law. The archetypal figures embodied qualities and potentials that listeners could recognize within themselves and their communities, providing models for spiritual development that were both inspirational and practically applicable to the challenges of medieval existence. The cycle offered hope that individual struggles and sufferings served larger purposes that would eventually become apparent to those who persevered in their commitment to growth and service. As the winter storytelling season reached its climax, during the 12 nights between Christmas and Epiphany, Marguerite would share the most sacred and transformative tales in her repertoire, stories that had been preserved across generations, not merely as folklore, but as vehicles for spiritual transmission that could awaken dormant potentials within human consciousness and create lasting changes in the lives of those who receive them with appropriate reverence and understanding. These final winter tales possessed a quality that set them apart from all other forms of narrative entertainment. They seemed to emerge from sources that transcended ordinary human creativity, carrying within them wisdom and power that could only be fully appreciated by those who approached them as sacred teachings rather than mere stories. The words themselves became incantations that could alter consciousness and opened doorways to realms of experience that remained hidden from ordinary perception. The most profound of these sacred narratives was the tale of the Mirror of Souls, which could only be told during the darkest night of the winter solstice, when the boundary between worlds grew thin and supernatural influences could more easily affect human consciousness. This story concerned a mystical artifact that had been created by angels during the first days of creation, when the divine light was still pure and undivided by the complexities of material existence. The mirror possessed the ability to reflect not the physical appearance of those who gazed into its surface, but the true condition of their souls as perceived by divine consciousness. Those who looked upon their reflection in this sacred glass saw themselves as they truly were, beneath the masks and pretenses that concealed their authentic nature from both themselves and others. The experience was simultaneously terrifying and liberating, revealing both the depths of human corruption and the heights of spiritual potential that existed within every created being. The tale followed the mirror's journey through human history as it passed from keeper to keeper, each one chosen not through worldly power or wealth, but through spiritual readiness that qualified them to serve as guardians of such a profound and dangerous treasure. Each keeper faced unique challenges in learning to use the mirror's power wisely, understanding when its revelations could serve healing purposes and when they might cause more harm than good. The story revealed that the mirror's true purpose was not to judge or condemn those who gazed upon their spiritual reflections, but to inspire the kind of authentic self-knowledge that could serve as the foundation for genuine transformation and spiritual growth. Those who had the courage to confront their own darkness discovered that this acknowledgement was the first step toward transcending the limitations that had previously bound them to cycles of suffering and ignorance. The most remarkable aspect of the tale of the Mirror of Souls was its capacity to function as a mirror itself, reflecting back to listeners' insights about their own spiritual condition that seemed to emerge naturally from their engagement with the narrative. Those who heard the story with genuine openness found themselves experiencing the kind of self-revelation that the magical artifact provided to characters within the tale. This transformative quality made the story both precious and dangerous, requiring careful judgment about when and to whom it could be safely told. Marguerite had learned from her predecessors that the tale should only be shared with audiences who had been prepared through exposure to the less intense stories of the winter cycle, and only during the sacred season when spiritual influences were strongest and most supportive of profound inner change. The tale of the Mirror of Souls served as the culmination of the entire year's storytelling cycle, weaving together themes and insights that had been developed through the seasonal progression of narratives into a unified vision of human potential and divine purpose that could sustain and inspire listeners throughout the challenges of the coming year. As the sacred words echoed in the candlelit darkness of that longest night, they created bonds between storyteller and audience that transcended ordinary social relationships, establishing connections based on shared participation in mysteries that revealed the deepest meanings of existence itself. Medieval audiences understood that such stories were not merely entertaining diversions, but powerful technologies of consciousness that could create lasting changes in those who received them with appropriate reverence and commitment to the inner work they required. The tales served as bridges between the mundane world of daily survival and the sacred realm of eternal truth, offering guidance and inspiration that could transform ordinary existence into a form of spiritual practice that honored both human dignity and divine purpose. As winter's deepest night gave way to the gradual return of light and the promise of spring's eventual arrival, these sacred narratives would settle into the hearts and minds of listeners like seeds planted in fertile soil, waiting for the proper conditions to germinate and produce fruits of wisdom that could nourish both individual souls and entire communities for generations to come. The ancient voices that spoke through Marguerite's careful preservation and transmission of these timeless tales continue to whisper across the centuries to any who have ears to hear their eternal message of hope, transformation, and the possibility of transcendence that remains forever available to those who seek it with sincere hearts and dedicated spirits. In the flickering light of medieval hearthfires and the quiet darkness of contemporary nights, these stories remind us that we are all participants in the great wheel of existence, called to play our part in the eternal drama of awakening that connects every human soul to purposes and possibilities that extend far beyond the boundaries of any single lifetime or historical period. The tradition of seasonal storytelling that Marguerite embodied reached its most sophisticated expression in the way these tales were woven together across multiple years, creating larger patterns of meaning that could only be perceived by those who participated in the full cycle of narrative transmission over extended periods. Each winter brought subtle variations and additions to familiar stories, while new tales emerged from the collective unconscious of the community to address challenges and opportunities that previous generations had not encountered. This organic evolution of the storytelling tradition reflected the medieval understanding that wisdom was not a fixed body of knowledge, but a living process that required constant renewal and adaptation to remain relevant to changing circumstances. The stories served as vessels that could carry eternal truths while adapting their surface details to speak to the particular concerns of each generation and each specific community that received them. The most remarkable aspect of this adaptive quality was the way individual storytellers like Marguerite could sense when new narratives were needed and allow them to emerge through their practiced intuition and deep connection to the spiritual needs of their audiences. These new tales would often appear during moments of particular crisis or transition, providing exactly the guidance and perspective that communities required to navigate unfamiliar challenges while maintaining their connection to the deeper values and purposes that define their collective identity. Consider the emergence of the tale of the bridge builder, which first appeared in Marguerite's repertoire during a winter when her village faced unprecedented challenges from changing trade routes that threatened to isolate them from the broader economic networks that had sustained their prosperity for generations. The story seemed to arise spontaneously during one of her telling sessions, emerging from sources that transcended her individual creativity while addressing the specific anxieties and opportunities that her community was experiencing. The tale concerned a master craftsman named Willem, who had devoted his life to building bridges that could span seemingly impossible distances and connect communities that had previously been separated by natural barriers or ancient feuds. His structures were marvels of engineering that combined practical functionality with aesthetic beauty, creating pathways that inspired those who crossed them, while serving the essential purpose of facilitating communication and commerce between previously isolated populations. But Willem's greatest challenge came when he was commissioned to build a bridge across a chasm that seemed to exist, not just in the physical landscape, but in the realm of human understanding itself. The communities on either side of this divide had developed such different languages, customs, and ways of thinking that they could barely comprehend each other's existence, much less find common ground for cooperation or mutual benefit. Traditional bridge-building techniques proved inadequate for spanning this particular gap, as the challenge involved not just engineering considerations, but the need to create understanding between groups whose fundamental assumptions about reality were so different that they seemed to inhabit entirely separate worlds. Willem realized that his usual tools and materials would be insufficient for constructing a pathway that could accommodate such radically different approaches to existence. His solution required him to develop new forms of perception and skill that transcended conventional craftsmanship. Willem began to study not just the physical characteristics of the terrain he needed to span, but the subtle patterns of thought and feeling that shaped how each community understood their relationship to the world around them. He learned to perceive the hidden bridges that already existed in the form of shared human needs and aspirations that transcended cultural differences. The bridge he eventually constructed operated on multiple levels simultaneously, serving as both a physical pathway that allowed safe passage across the dangerous chasm and a symbolic representation of the possibility for understanding between seemingly incompatible worldviews. The materials he used included not just stone and timber, but songs and stories that could carry meaning across linguistic barriers, creating a structure that appealed to both practical necessity and imaginative possibility. The most innovative aspect of Willem's design was its incorporation of spaces for encounter and dialogue that encouraged travelers to pause during their crossing and engage with representatives of the communities they were approaching. These meeting places became laboratories for developing new forms of communication that could bridge not just physical distances, but the conceptual gaps that had previously made meaningful exchange impossible. As word of Willem's achievements spread throughout the region, other communities began requesting similar structures that could help them overcome their own isolation and connect with neighbors whose differences had previously seemed insurmountable. The bridge builder's work became a catalyst for broader transformation, as people discovered that apparent obstacles to understanding often concealed opportunities for mutual enrichment and learning. Medieval audiences would have recognized in Willem's story reflections of their own experiences with the cultural changes that characterized their rapidly evolving world, the expansion of trade networks, the encounter with different religious traditions, and the gradual emergence of new forms of social organization created challenges that required innovative approaches to maintaining community cohesion while adapting to unprecedented circumstances. The tale provided a framework for understanding how apparent threats to traditional ways of life could be transformed into opportunities for growth and development that honored the past while embracing necessary change. Willem's evolution from conventional craftsman to creator of bridges between worlds illustrated the kind of adaptive creativity that medieval people recognized as essential for navigating the complexities of their transitional era. The bridge builder also addressed deeper spiritual themes that reflected medieval understanding of the relationship between human consciousness and divine purpose. Willem's ability to perceive hidden connections and create structures that facilitated understanding paralleled the mystical vision that recognized underlying unity beneath surface diversity, suggesting that apparent separations were often illusions that could be transcended through appropriate spiritual development. The tale's emphasis on dialogue and mutual learning reflected medieval educational philosophy that viewed wisdom as emerging through encounter with different perspectives, rather than through isolated study of established authorities. Willem's bridge became a metaphor for the kind of intellectual and spiritual openness that could lead to genuine understanding of truth that transcended any single cultural or philosophical tradition. As spring arrived and Marguerite's community began to emerge from their winter contemplation into the active season of planting and growth, stories like the bridge builder would be remembered and discussed in contexts that connected their symbolic meanings to practical decisions about how to respond to the changing circumstances that each new year brought. The narratives served as resources for collective wisdom that could guide communities through processes of adaptation and development while maintaining continuity with essential values and purposes. The organic relationship between storytelling and practical life that characterized medieval culture ensured that these tales remained vital and relevant, rather than becoming fossilized relics of past wisdom. Each telling was an opportunity for reinterpretation and application that kept the stories alive as sources of guidance for contemporary challenges, while preserving their essential insights for transmission to future generations. This dynamic quality of medieval folklore represented one of the most sophisticated achievements of oral tradition, creating a technology of cultural transmission that could maintain stability while accommodating change, preserving wisdom while encouraging innovation, and honoring the past while serving the present. The storytellers who maintained these traditions served as guardians of collective memory and facilitators of ongoing adaptation that allowed communities to thrive across generations of challenge and transformation. The deep winter nights when these most profound tales were shared created bonds between community members that extended far beyond mere entertainment or social gathering. Participants in these storytelling sessions became part of a spiritual fellowship that was united by shared exposure to mysteries and insights that could transform individual consciousness while strengthening collective identity and purpose. The experience of listening to stories like The Mirror of Souls or The Bridge Builder in the sacred atmosphere of candle-lit darkness created memories that participants would carry throughout their lives, returning to these narratives during moments of personal crisis or important decision-making as sources of guidance that had been validated through community witness and collective wisdom. The tales became part of the inner landscape of all who received them, providing compass points for navigating the complex terrain of human existence. Medieval people understood that such stories possessed the power to shape reality by influencing the attitudes, expectations, and choices that determined how individuals and communities responded to the challenges and opportunities that life presented. A village that regularly heard tales about the possibility of building bridges between different worlds was more likely to approach cultural encounters with openness and creativity than a community whose folklore emphasized conflict and separation. This recognition of narrative as a form of practical magic that could influence outcomes in the material world was not primitive superstition, but sophisticated understanding of how consciousness shapes experience. Medieval communities had observed that groups with rich traditions of hopeful, transformative storytelling tended to be more resilient and adaptive than those whose cultural narratives emphasized limitation and defeat. The seasonal cycle of storytelling thus served multiple functions simultaneously, providing entertainment that made long winter evenings bearable, preserving historical memory and cultural values, transmitting practical wisdom about agriculture and social organization, and creating the psychological and spiritual conditions that enabled communities to thrive across generations of change and challenge. Marguerite's mastery of this complex tradition made her an essential figure, not just in her village's cultural life, but in its practical survival and continued development. Her stories carried within them the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, while remaining flexible enough to address contemporary needs and circumstances. She served as a bridge between past and future, ensuring that essential insights would survive, while new understanding could emerge to meet unprecedented challenges. The tales she preserved and transmitted represented humanity's most profound attempts to understand the relationship between individual existence and cosmic purpose, between temporal concerns and eternal values, between human limitation and divine possibility. These narratives offered frameworks for making sense of suffering and joy, success and failure, birth and death that could provide meaning and motivation, regardless of external circumstances. As our journey through this rich tradition of medieval folklore draws toward its natural conclusion, we begin to understand why these ancient voices continue to speak across the centuries to contemporary hearts seeking guidance for navigating life's eternal challenges. The wisdom embedded in these tales transcends historical circumstance, offering insights about courage, compassion, transformation, and the pursuit of authentic purpose that remain as vital today as they were in those firelit halls where storytellers first gave them voice. The sophisticated psychology and spiritual understanding that characterized medieval folklore represented one of humanity's most successful attempts to create sustainable cultures that could nurture both individual development and community well-being across generations of change and uncertainty. These stories provided technologies of consciousness that could maintain hope during periods of darkness, inspire creativity in the face of limitations, and foster the kinds of relationships and values that made civilized life possible. The storytellers who maintained these traditions served as guardians of collective wisdom, ensuring that essential insights about human nature, spiritual development, and social organization were preserved and transmitted in forms that could remain accessible and relevant, regardless of changing external circumstances. Their art represented one of the highest achievements of medieval civilization, creating bridges between earthly and heavenly concerns that allowed ordinary people to participate in transcendent purposes while meeting the practical demands of daily existence. In the gentle rhythm of seasonal storytelling, in the careful preservation of ancient wisdom, in the organic adaptation of eternal truths to contemporary needs, we find models for cultural transmission and spiritual development that remain as valuable today as they were in Marguerite's village so many centuries ago. These medieval voices whisper still to any who have hearts to receive their timeless message of hope, transformation, and the eternal possibility of transcendence that awaits all who seek it with sincere dedication and open spirits. The wheel of seasons continues to turn, bringing new challenges and opportunities that require the same wisdom, courage, and community bonds that sustained our ancestors through their own periods of darkness and renewal. In these ancient tales of dragons and bridges, gardens and mirrors, harvest festivals and winter mysteries, we find not just entertainment for quiet hours, but practical guidance for the eternal human journey toward understanding, purpose, and genuine fulfillment that connects every individual soul to purposes and possibilities that extend far beyond the boundaries of any single lifetime or historical era. As our journey through these 1,000 years of medieval folklore draws to its natural close, we find ourselves transformed by the ancient wisdom that has flowed through these timeless tales. From Marguerite's humble hearth in that long-ago French village to the sacred mysteries shared during winter's deepest nights, we have witnessed how stories served as far more than mere entertainment for our ancestors. These narratives were living vessels of wisdom, carrying within them practical knowledge about healing and agriculture, profound insights into human psychology and spiritual development, and frameworks for understanding the eternal questions that continue to shape our existence today. Through tales of clever peasant girls and compassionate dragon slayers, dream merchants and bridge builders, we have discovered how medieval communities created sustainable cultures that could nurture both individual growth and collective well-being across generations of challenge and change. The sophisticated storytelling tradition we have explored represents one of humanity's most remarkable achievements in preserving and transmitting essential knowledge through times of upheaval and transformation. These tales speak to something eternal within the human spirit, offering guidance that transcends historical circumstance and remains as relevant to our contemporary struggles as it was to those who first gathered around flickering hearth fires to hear them shared. As you drift towards sleep, may these ancient voices continue to whisper their timeless wisdom, reminding you that we are all participants in the great wheel of existence, connected to purposes and possibilities that extend far beyond the boundaries of any single lifetime. In the gentle rhythm of seasonal cycles and the enduring power of story, we find hope, meaning, and the eternal promise of renewal that awaits all who seek it with sincere hearts and open spirits.